Hi, everyone. My name is Jeffrey, and I'm here with Sylvia, and we're going to be talking about Plotinus, Chapter 1. But before we delve into this, we should probably introduce ourselves. So, Sylvia, tell us about yourself and your background in philosophy and that sort of thing.
So my background is completely autodidactic, pretty much. I just grew up with my mother being also an autodidactic historian of Roman antiquity and very much into the classic philosophers and pounding into our brain that we needed to know these things. My mother's Italian and I'm Italian American. I just remember like at age 8, her being at the table after dinner and asking us to recite who the like major senators of the republic were, or who the emperors were, or the main Greek classical philosophers. And I'm like, I'm 8, I have no idea. And her turning to my dad and being like, this is why American education system is no good, even though I really doubt that they were teaching that to 8-year-olds. But I've grown up to now appreciate it, and I just love doing this on my own. I have the liberty to study some of these things on my own. I don't have a formal background in it, but just there's so much stuff out there now, and wonderful people like yourself I can meet and can kind of have a dialogue with, and so many great channels out there also, like on YouTube, where there are academics who do want to open this up to other people. And it's been very fun for me so far, especially in the last 3-4 years since the pandemic. It's allowed me to take more time to look into this kind of stuff.
Definitely. The last couple of years, especially during the pandemic, we had a lot of time sitting at home. So I also read a lot of philosophy. My background is actually more in Buddhist studies. So I started off in my undergraduate years looking at, Japanese and Chinese languages, followed by a study of Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism. But at the same time, too, I also studied a lot of Stoicism, in particular the Stoic ethics, and then later I also went into the physics and so on. So Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, these sort of figures. And so throughout the years, I've studied different schools of philosophy. I'm actually not necessarily an expert in philosophy as a field. I'm more of like a philologist, textual scholar. But I like looking at Greek philosophy in particular, the Platonic thought and the Stoic thought, alongside my more formal studies of Buddhist and Taoist philosophies. So I think this sort of engagement where we can both look at a text together and we can discuss it will be very, very fruitful. So I'm really glad that we have this sort of opportunity, and so we can basically jump in. So we're going to be looking at chapter 1, the first section of Plotinus.
Of the Enneads.
Of the Enneads.
Just in case anybody isn't aware of what we're talking about. And I did want to add one more thing. So
Sure.
How we came to decide, or like, basically we, just for transparency, because I'm very, you know how I am, I'm very open. We came to like decide to kind of do this podcast or not aside because of the use, and I've been meaning to read this book forever, but it is quite intimidating. And you had suggested to me, and we're so generous to say you'd read it along with me, because I came to you kind of as a friend and a spiritual friend, asking for some clarity or some recommendations as far as some spiritual confusion or questioning or turmoil I was having at the time. And we kind of come from not from similar backgrounds, but are currently kind of in a similar wheelhouse of spirituality. And that's kind of how we met, was through organizations that are tied to the ancient Roman polytheistic movement and things of that nature. So my hope for this is not just that it would be great for anybody who just wants to have somebody to listen along with, or like, I don't know. I don't have any, most of my friends aren't exactly people who are going to sit there and listen to me drone on about a book that's over 1,000 years old or wonder about it. So I also hope that from beyond it just being academic, it might be helpful for people who do look to things like this as a spiritual tool, because I think regardless of where you're coming from, there's truths to be found here.
Definitely. In the past, I've read Plotinus and Iamblichus, and also modern surveys of Neoplatonic thought, as well as Plato as well. And I found it to be therapeutic, just as the study of a lot of philosophy, ancient philosophy,
Mhm.
can be very therapeutic because it makes you examine your own thoughts and beliefs in a new way, in a critical way. And it also might allow you to look at your own worldview and cosmology in a different way that can be beneficial. So, as we've discussed before, I really appreciate the Platonic cosmology, where there is this idea of, well, in Plato originally there is the demiurge, but then in Neoplatonism, it's a little bit more elaborated. So you have the one, so that's the monistic principle, not necessarily a personality or a godhead, from which you have the divine forms, which are effectively infinite potentials as a inevitable reflection of the one, which
Mhm.
then leads to the reflection of the intellect as the soul, the psyche, which is the emotional, not emotional, but yeah, the desire for the forms, and then the inevitable reflection of that is material reality, and then within material reality we see reflections of the divine form, divine forms, and that sort of cosmology. You also see that a lot in later magical treatises as well. So, for example, Picatrix, Gayat al-Hakim, that sort of Neoplatonic cosmology is there. It's much more elaborated. I mean, we're going to discuss Plotinus,
Right.
but then you have a practitioner of theurgy, Iamblichus, later on, who also elaborates on this to a great extent as well. And so this sort of cosmology is an interesting cosmology also because it was used by different people throughout the centuries after Plotinus and Iamblichus as well.
Oh,
And
definitely. It also influenced individuals such as Thomas Aquinas. I mean, Summa Theologica
mhm,
is definitely coming from, well, I don't know so much probably Plotinus as well, because there's much more there. And I'm not sure if I may be wrong, if Iamblichus would be up his alley, but definitely just Platonic thought in general has influenced pretty much all of Western thought, from Christianity to Islamic philosophers. And I think the way in which Plotinus fleshes a lot of these ideas out were definitely things that were read and deeply influenced a lot of people who came from the Abrahamic and probably and other like smaller, now maybe non-existent credos.
definitely, definitely. So it has a very broad influence throughout history, and so a lot of people also today are reading Plotinus and Iamblichus, and so it still has a lot of influence.
So do we want to very briefly, if anybody listening in is kind of may have like an idea of who he is, but doesn't really know much about him, there's definitely Porphyry's Life of Plotinus that is pretty short and easy to get through. Do you want to give a real brief description or biography of Plotinus and who he is in the context of the period he was in, beyond just being someone who was a Platonist? And
Right. Well, I mean, he's sort of known as the successor to the Middle Platonists,
Mhm.
and as we read in his biography in Porphyry, he had a sort of uh, travel-bound career,
Yeah.
right? So, can you fill in those details, Sylvia?
Oh yeah, sure. So 204 to 270
Hmm.
Common Era. He is believed to maybe have been from Egypt, I think. Certainly, Sakas was his first educator, who was also the educator of a couple of other philosophers whom I can't remember their names right now.
Right.
But
And
they were kind of all colleagues and friends or frenemies.
mhm,
And one of the stories kind of tied to this is that Sakas had passed on, kind of occult information to
mhm.
his students, which he didn't really want them to, make public. And the theory is that some of them did and some of them didn't. So I'm also curious to see if, or as we're reading this or like looking more into this, if what Plotinus wrote or spoke of maybe did reveal whatever alleged information Sakas passed on to him. There's like different theories about who the Sakas guy was. Some think he was like an Indian named Sachi or something. But I've
Sakya,
also
yeah, Shakya.
Shakya, yeah. But there's also evidence or arguments against it, that he was actually just from Alexandria, I think.
Hmm.
So anyways, as you said, he then moved to the Italic continent. I think he went to Sicily. Is that where he was based out of? Was it Sicily or was it around Naples? I don't remember. We're gonna have to look at that.
Right.
And look at that. But I remember most his teaching style was very much in the peripatetic. It was close enough, in my opinion, to the peripatetic style, but a little less annoying, I guess, than Socrates. He wasn't going up to random people at the mall and bothering them, but
Right.
he would.
He was a
but
professional educator.
yes, it was open to the public pretty much, and he had a big following, and he would basically just be out. I don't remember. I'm sure it was at a specific location. I don't remember which one it was because I can't remember if he was in Sicily. Oh yeah, he was in Syracuse. Well, he has a whole history with Syracuse as well, but we'll get into that maybe at some other point. And people, it was more of a conversational kind of teaching. And Porphyry is amongst his, well, he is, like, as far as from a historical perspective, his most important student, because he's the one who then, with the help of some of the other students and his other colleagues, amalgamated all of his writings, because he did write himself. Porphyry, Plotinus did, and I think in addition, with notes that they had taken themselves, then later amalgamated all his different lectures that they had access to once he passed into the Enneads, which are numbered. Like, the way that he put it together is a little different than how it was written.
Right.
And
The chronology is different from what happened in real life. Right. So the first section is actually from later on in Plotinus's career.
And I guess beyond that, we speak of them as Middle Platonists and Neoplatonists, but I don't think in their own era they were calling themselves this. They just saw themselves as Platonists. Oh, another thing I wanted to mention, like, apparently he was like very well seen, very well reputed in his community, because he's kind of known as to have had an orphanage, but it wasn't, I don't think, anything organized like we have today. But there was various people of wealth who would like leave their children with him, or if they passed, had written such that they would go live with him. And he had basically, like, in that sense, an orphanage of all these children that he took care of and provided for and provided an education for. And from what's come down, there is definitely a sense of civic duty and empathy. That's how I would frame it. Even despite the fact that, as we get into this and his like metaphysics and parts of the material, that the material is not the good, I would not go so far as to say that he thinks that the world here and everything about it is evil in the same way that some of the Gnostic schools felt. He definitely was looking to uplift himself to the one, and there's different instances in which, according to his disciples, according to Porphyry, there was like 4 or 5 times in which he was quote unquote enlightened. But he was still very much a person who also thought it was important to live a good life here and be a good person here, which I think is important. I think the way philosophers live their life and what personality or character they had is just as important, if not in some way more important to them as a person than what they say, because you gotta walk the walk. I mean, that's how I feel. I'm very practical. So if you say one thing and do another, I don't know, I'm gonna look for someone else.
Yeah, it seems like the Neoplatonists were generally involved in society. They didn't take on the ideal of renunciation.
No.
So Porphyry and Iamblichus, they were, scholars, philosophers, engaged with people. They had disciples. They were part of public life, so they didn't have an idea of becoming like monastic recluses, living out in caves and so on. So I suppose you could say the outcome of this philosophy, if you understand it and practice it, is that you'll not necessarily try to escape the world. It's not that you're trying to escape all material desires and so forth, but rather to develop wisdom and a better understanding of reality. And from that, naturally, civil virtues and moral virtues and so forth will be the natural outcome.
Right. And also just realizing not so much that we need to escape this specific place, but maybe these are my words, silence to a degree those lower chaotic material aspects of the embodied soul, so that with that clarity we can realize that the intelligible, it's everywhere, but often that is clouded by other things. So it's not so much about leaving where you're at, but having a better perception of what is actually going on, and
One
which will lead to, which can only be reached through, according to them, what right action and right, I don't want to say right thought, but right focus is, like what you're focusing on.
Definitely. One thing that comes to mind with my understanding of Neoplatonic cosmology is that, so you have the one, the intellect, and the soul, and it's not that the soul is individually fragmented at that sort of metaphysical level, but rather there's a kind of world soul. There's a unity there. So once you have the embodied physical forms that we have, that's when you have a sort of fragmentation.
Right, but the fragmentation is only the personality or the characteristics that come from the material form. The embodied aspect, that part of the complex, is what's giving it fragmentation. It's not the soul. So the way I imagine it, and this is going to sound very silly, but imagine like Nickelodeon goop, that stuff. Do you remember?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I imagine that as like the world soul, and it's all together, but little drops of it are in each embodied soul. So like in the sense that each little drop of it isn't been separated. It's just gooping into each of us. And we're just, I know this is like probably the silliest way of describing this that's happened in the past 1,000 years, but that's me. But so it's still all connected. That large that form that is the soul is not disconnected amongst us. It's just that bits of it, or like goops of it, are in each little embodied form or body, or I mean, he takes it so far as to, it's not just humans. He postures that perhaps even animals to some degree have to have some soul, otherwise they would not even have motion. And so far, well, even the entire world, everything, the whole world, everything has, anything that is animated or has some level of motion or has some level of soul in it to animate it. So that everything in some way is actually connected. It's
the sort of parallel that comes to mind, and I think this is already in the classical writings, is like if you bend light, so you have white light and then it goes through, for example, glass, like a prism, and you see the rainbow of colors. But that's just a perception that we have. It's not that the white light has actually been broken down inherently, or that it's something, it's transformed into something different. It's just from a different point of view. It's like when you see a rainbow in a sky, it's the same white light that you would normally see. It's just that from one other perspective, it seems fragmented, and then you get a diverse range of colors. So the sort of sense that we have of being individuals walking around the material world separate from one another is one perspective, but at a sort of higher metaphysical perspective, it all is the one world soul.
right.
And that comes to mind some Buddhist ideas where effectively, once you eliminate the sense of self and other, then compassion just naturally arises. And I think with the Neoplatonic cosmology as well, if you really contemplate that reality of what is a soul and how does it relate to a wider cosmology, then I think compassion is the natural outcome. And then sort of going back to some Stoic ideas as well, it's not so much about soul, but rather if in the absence of passions or, sort of afflictive emotions and so forth, then in a natural calm state, then people are naturally compassionate and concerned for one another. It's just that when you have an erroneous view and you're led by passions, which are inherently tied to material reality in most instances, then you get all sorts of evils arising. And so in a Neoplatonic point of view, our desire and our sort of insistence on material pleasures and our beliefs that are inherently tied to the material reality as well is very limited, but it's also a cause for a lot of evils. Whereas I think if you have a wiser understanding, then you'll just naturally have less attachment and less interest and a less emotional investment in a lot of things in the material reality that would normally be cause for a lot of evils and misdeeds and evil words and actions and that sort of thing. So I think
Right.
understanding this sort of philosophy and contemplating it ideally leads to not just civil virtues where you're a good person to other people, but also an inherent sort of compassion for other people and a tolerance also
Right.
as well. Yeah.
I think it comes from like a different concept though of good and evil than most people may be listening or thinking of from like a Western or Christian point of view. So rereading the Theaetetus early on in the book, there's a point in which Plato kind of states something in the portion where he's still talking about the development of the world and the world soul in the Theaetetus. There's a line which struck me in which basically he doesn't state so much that it's evil, but that it's those part like desire and passions and so forth. It's that since the intellect is pure reason, and so when we are more when we are more focused on the intellect that comes through the soul on us, in our life, it's reason. We are in a state. We're in more of a state of reason, and everything that is not tied directly to the intellect and through the soul, that is just the material, is chaos. And so all these other feelings that arise, all this other stuff, all the evils of the world, he pretty much says, are really because they're like a randomized chaos. And I found that to be an interesting way of looking at it, of looking instead of good and evil, that the things that we call good and evil are just symptomatic of either reason or chaos. And I think that like very well ties in with even more modern or theoretical scientific ideas of cosmology. This idea of, is the universe purely chaotic? Is the universe purely ordered? And I tend to think that there's truth in that. There's aspects of both of this, even from what is observable empirically. I think it's very telling of a lot of things, such as entropy, this chaos, that it's all very tied together. So do we want to start looking at the actual chapters? Because we've just given kind of like a very 1,000-mile up talk about all of this.
Right.
So this is a first read for me, and I think a second or a third read for you. And let me tell you, I got like a million questions. So
Right.
Comments.
Yes. Well, Plotinus is a challenging philosopher to read, and moreover, we're reading it in an English translation. So that also amplifies some of the difficulty as well, because we're not looking at the original Greek. So this was published by Cambridge University Press, first published in 2018. And I feel that this translation is quite consistent and it's readable. And then there's also a lot of footnotes and also the introductions to the chapters also gives you an idea before you read it, what you should be looking for. And it gives a nice overview of everything. So it's kind of it's a user-friendly edition.
Yeah, and it has like a dictionary in the back and also a list of important ancient Greek words with their definitions, and also like English definitions of some of these terms that were created by or used by Plotinus, similar to or differently from Plato.
Right. So it's a good edition. And so rather than relying on the outdated translation that was published by Penguin, we have this newer one available. So it makes reading it so much easier. So in the very first section, 1.1, the question is, what is the living being and what is the human being? And as the editors of the translation point out, that it's a later treatise. So it's coming from later on in his career, but in the process of editing it in antiquity, they decided, Porphyry perhaps decided to put it at the very beginning. So Plotinus is looking at the relation between the self and the human being, which would be composed of the body and soul. And as the editors note, he's trying to follow Plato, but then he's also drawing on like Aristotelian ideas as well. And the key point of this chapter is that, and I quote, Plotinus will identify the true self with the immortal, undescended intellect and the embodied subject of psychical activities as its image. This distinction between immortal and mortal kinds of soul, drawn from Timaeus, that is to say Plato, will provide the basis for his explanation of punishment and moral responsibility. It is only the embodied self that can be held responsible. So Plotinus is discussing in detail what exactly we are. So can you give some of your initial thoughts, Sylvia, on this chapter?
So my understanding was that our true self is the immortal, undescended intellect. That we're never truly, perhaps, our true self while living, but there are the impressions of it, because so there's the one, which is everything. It's almost it's unknowable, really, is my understanding, which is it's just common in other religions too, and I think it definitely comes from the Platonic tradition and probably other ones, but definitely also from Plato. And from that, what emanated, and the idea here is that the one is not like a sentient god. It's, I would say, something more like what you would think of a great unknowable natural force, or a supernatural force, I guess. And from it, naturally or supernaturally, emanates the intellect, which is kind of the mind of the one, and it's it's anything and everything that can be thought of ever is in the intellect. And from that comes down, and from that emanates the soul, which I used to have kind of struggle with this, and I probably don't still understand it well, but my understanding is kind of that the soul is the creative force or the desire to then, in the sense, if we want to make a comparison with something that we can grasp better, which is ourselves, think of the intellect as, and this is not, I'm not saying this is apples to apples, but just to kind of have like a general idea, if you're struggling with it, that the intellect is all of the ideas that you have or can ever have. So I might have ideas or thoughts about a lot of things, but they don't necessarily always inspire creativity or the desire to do things. Those ideas that do then inspire me to be creative, or want to create, basically be creative in any sense of the word, or that desire to interact with the things of that thought more, would be kind of the soul. But unlike me, the soul and the intellect, I think pretty much, now I may be wrong because he doesn't say this in this chapter, so we'll get to that at some point. So I don't know if everything that is intellect, that is in the intellect, is necessarily also manifested in the soul, because I don't know if everything possible and thinkable actually through the soul then exists in materiality. But basically, that all the soul is that desire to create the things that are the ideas of the intellect, and then the soul, from its desire to create, generation comes, which is the creation of material things such as you, me, trees, animals, indirectly even probably that's another discussion which has been made before, like artificial and, or like, we don't really have artificial intelligence, don't come at me, but like artificial intelligence or robotic mechanisms, things to this degree, how much do they have soul or not? Because they exist. So if it exists in this scheme, it needs to come from the soul and the intellect, and the one ultimately, but the intellect.
Right.
So that's what the soul is. It's kind of that desire and creativity. And so that's kind of like the framework which he sets up. And then he gets into more, what is the human being, or what is the living being, which could be human or not. And then he kind of starts getting to the human being later in the chapter. But as far as the living being, it's kind of this, I think he calls it this is part that gets kind of confusing. He talks about that it is both the soul in the being, in the material aspect, so that's the embodied soul. But then he also talks about, I think he uses the term complex or compound, but he kind of like makes a differentiation between, there's like, or maybe I'm misunderstanding, and this is something I want to talk to you about. He speaks to, there's the soul in the body, but then there's aspects of animation which are the soul, which is tied to the body, which are like the complex. But then there's aspects of the soul that are kind of separate completely from the body. So it's kind of this like two two-sided thing with one of them having like a low another level of I don't know, confusion to me. So that's, I guess, one of my questions was about that. What is he talking about when he starts? I guess, is that one of the questions? How can the states of the body be transmitted? So in what sense is the soul actively involved with the body, and in what sense is it impassive? I guess that kind of speaks to that, because he mentioned sometimes that the soul is, animating the body, but it's also separate from it. And then there's this other aspect that is kind of intrinsically mixed up with, and he speaks to a difference between things being blended or woven together, and kind of puts that as a question. Is the soul woven with the body, or is it blended together into like one frothy mix? You can't tell the difference. I don't know.
Right. And he also points out, just as craftsmen are not subjects of the states of their instruments. So he points out, for example, I quote, "If then on the one hand it uses the body as an instrument, it does not have to be the subject of states that come through the body, just as craftsmen are not the subjects of the states of their instruments." So there is a sort of distinction drawn there between whether the soul is actually caught up with the experiences, or it's more of kind of like a director of the whole process or not. And so he's going through, like, a number of questions of, like, well, as you said, like, is the soul interwoven or is it intermixed? What is happening? And so ultimately, there is this undescended intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And that, because it's undescended, that means it can't be subject to states like fear and appetites and so forth, as it is quoted here. "In fact, it is the case that appetite belongs to the soul's faculty of appetite, and spiritedness belongs to the soul's faculty of spiritedness, and generally the inclination towards something belongs to the soul's faculty of desire."
And by spirited and appetite, he means passion and desire. Yeah, the complex perceives because of the presence of the soul, but part of the complex can create the psychic powers of the living being. So this use of the term complex that he has is what confuses me.
Yeah, it is challenging, admittedly, and I find this challenging as well.
And that the soul's sense perception is not sensibles, but is the impressions that arise from sense perception. He kind of talks about when we're, so like once, that's another thing he talks about, which is you and me, us embodied souls, the things that we're seeing are sense perception. Like, I'm seeing this mug, but a sense perception is really me just perceiving the impression of the form of the mug, I think is what he's saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So does the underlying, and this, I don't know if you know, but like the question that comes then to me is like, so does that mean that material, like there's nothing actually there? Or is it because, I guess, the only thing that we have this body as kind of a tool, but the soul can't perceive anything that isn't intelligible? Is that why? So therefore it would only perceive the impression of the perfect form of the cup and not the, the material portion.
Well, that begs the question then, is there matter that exists apart from ideas? So
right.
Is there unintelligible matter? And I would suspect no, because matter itself doesn't have any sort of fixed form, and whatever form it does take is effectively subject to ideation. Or
okay, so in today's terms, maybe would it be something like, is what he's saying kind of like what we're perceiving is the atoms and subparticles that have been, or maybe even for, like subatomic particles that have been molded or arranged as they are, so that we perceive a cup, which therefore, and it's only arranged in such a manner because of the ideation of it, because really these subparticles could literally be anything. They're not like, they, as you said, don't have a fixed form. Does that make sense? Because I know there's a lot of talk of that there's like, even the reality from a empirical point of view, reality doesn't really exist as we perceive it. It's just a bunch of stuff that I don't know, and I don't think they really know either, of why, or don't know fully, why things appear to have a certain form or sometimes take upon a certain form, but are not intrinsically or necessarily that thing.
I guess this is the realm of epistemology versus ontology. So epistemology is how we know things, and then there's ontology, which is the idea of how things exist.
Right.
And I think in this discussion, it's more in the realm of epistemology. Is how do we know things, and
Right.
what is the nature of the intellect relative to physical reality, but within the realm of knowing. So in one way, when you're attempting to understand the nature of this undescended intellect and how it relates to us, then talking about the physical composition of things, and whether these things exist outside of our ideation, if they exist outside of our own perception or not, kind of becomes a secondary concern, because we're trying to understand our function and identity within the world, and also how we would relate to a higher metaphysical or higher reality. And again, I think a lot of what's being discussed is meant toward a therapeutic end.
But he also puts up a frame. I see that. I mean, we got like 600 pages to go, but he is setting up a framework here, because you can't be in some way led to a better way of life, or some sort of consolation, or some sort of therapeutic way of perceiving things, if you can't even respect, trust, or buy into the idea. So he's like setting up the framework of how this stuff works.
Right.
So to me, I guess my point is just, I kind of see how some of these truths, little bits of truth, come across in the history of man in different ways. Some of the discourse that's going on in physics about the nature of reality and perception, to me, sounds a lot like what he's talking about, that when we perceive an object or things in the real world, it's not that the sense perception is perceiving the material, it's perceiving the impression of that object, the impression of its perfect form, of its form.
Mm-hmm.
Of the intelligible form.
So how would you understand this idea of form based on your reading? Like this idea of, often translated as the divine forms, eidos.
Cups, since I'm on the topic of mugs and cups. There are so many cups in different mugs, different material, different colors, different manufacturers. These are all particular. They're all particulars, and they only have an aspect. I mean, they're all different and fragmented. Something that is a form is kind of like the soul. I mean, not the soul, I'm sorry, like the one. It's the totality, the perfection, the indivisibility of the idea. And I think it's something that we can talk about till the cows come home, but probably is not something that in our everyday life as mortal beings we can fully grasp, but we can maybe, like, we can get an impression of what they are. I think this is as far as we can go. And so it's hard to even speak to it, I think. In the same way that the one or a God could be seen as the totality of everything and in a perfect, indivisible form, and isn't one version of it, but it's beyond even multiple versions. It's the true essence of the thing, and its most perfect and complete. It's the complete, perfect essence of a thing. So then apply to different things, such as Plato's talked about, and Plotinus, like beauty. Like when we see someone who's beautiful, or the beauty of nature, that's really just an impression. What we're tuning into is that there's an impression emanating down of the form of beauty. Beauty is the totality of everything that could be, is not even the totality of everything that could be beautiful. It just is beauty as a divine concept, which I guess. And so I don't think that humans can really grasp the divine forms. That's why we experience impressions of it, like bits of it, in things that are reflected. Not just materially, though, because sometimes we do have connection to the forms just in discursive thought completely. because you can have feeling, even like through philosophy or studying things that are not tied. It's not like music. It's not like music or paintings or nature where there's no sensorial aspect to it, but it's purely rational or mental. But you can still have that sensation of beauty in reading. Now, I want to differentiate like the different, not necessarily like the beauty of literature, and that could be there too, but the beauty of literature can be a coming together of both the reason or the idea, but also the beauty of the way in which it's written. Like something even like Plotinus. I don't think he's such a great writer, and I don't think I'm the only one to think that. But it's not so much the beauty or the aesthetics of the words on the page, but it's the beauty or the wisdom of the meaning, which then is purely abstract. It's not about it sounding or reading or being pretty or beautiful. So I think we do have some ability, if we're the kind of person that wants to, focus on those things in life, to grasp, to at least approach kind of having a relation with the forms that is, I don't know, more direct or not necessarily just their material things. And I'm using beauty, but maybe wisdom would be, the form of wisdom would be a better example in the analogy I made. So it's the perfection of all of these things, even mercy or curiosity. The idea of curiosity, as human beings, we're always talking about that one of the major characteristics of humans is that we are curious animals. What is curiosity? We can exemplify curiosity in a million different ways in our lives. But the idea of curiosity in its most ascended form, in its most ascended manner, would be the form of curiosity. That's my long-winded but not perfect answer to what I think. What I think I can understand of what forms are.
Right. Well, one classical example is, for example, a block of marble. And if you want to see a person in it, and then you have to carve a statue out of the block of marble. And then once you have a human form, then that is basically has become an expression of a form. The block of marble itself is sort of imprinted with that form, and then it's cognizable as, a human form.
So is it external? Is it assuming that it's actually external and independent from the viewer, or is it insinuating that you are connected to the soul and therefore you can perceive the idea, the creative idea of?
Well, the idea is that matter itself doesn't have any fixed form, whereas the idea itself is fixed. So there is, at a higher metaphysical reality, a human form.
So it's just the full potentiality of whatever, really, with that marble.
And then the marble is just an expression of it. But then if you pulverize the statue into rubble, then you no longer have the human form. But then you could take that pulverized marble, mix it with some clay, and then make the form of an animal, like the form of a dog, for example. And then the matter is then an expression of the form of a dog. So,
but that's coming from you, the individual who has the soul in you that you are projecting, in a sense, or your ability to be creative is projecting the idea of then creating that impression in the object. Or are you saying that form is always actually independent of me or you? It's already in the marble.
Well, it's not in the marble, but rather the marble is an expression of the form, but it's not necessarily permanent or fixed. The idea itself is permanent.
Okay, but it could be anything. Like all form ideas could,
right. But if
or a variety of them,
right.
Anyways.
But if I take the marble and I create a human form from it, we both agree that it's a human form. I mean, there might be, some degree of room for artistic license, but I mean, generally speaking, if I make a human form out of the marble, everybody will agree that, well, I see, yes, a human form. I mean, you can modify it to the extent that.
Well, I guess my question is this then: was it always destined to be a human form? I guess, is it predetermined to be a human form, or is it just our ability, the soul in us, that then will choose, and it's determined or indeterminate, but dependent upon us to create to flesh out the form from, or the statue from
Well,
the
that's an
intrinsic
that's
form.
an interesting question. So I see the marble and I want to make a human form. First of all, I have to know what a human form is.
But I might see the marble and I want to make a
Right.
statue of a cat or whatever.
And so you make the form of a cat. And
So that means it's dependent upon us. It's not
it's dependent upon us. But then there's other things that are outside of our control. Like, for example, a mountain. We didn't create the mountain, but we all recognize the form of a mountain.
But could you make the argument that maybe the mountain is closer to the one because it was directly created, I'm assuming, by the intellect or the soul? I mean, it's imbued with soul in a sense as well, right? But it's not an embodied soul then creating another thing. It's already, in a sense, an embodied soul itself. So it's created by the soul. It's created by the soul. The same way that we are created, the mountain is also created. One could argue that, or maybe not. It depends at what point the Genesis starts, because some could argue like the geological history of the earth, like what actually caused the mountains. But maybe that was all put in when the formation of the earth. That was all. Well, now we're getting to other areas, like a predetermination of what is determined or not of what the soul initially created in creating matter. But I would say that is not at the same level as the piece of marble, because we've gone into the mountain, cut out a piece of marble, and then we're messing with it further as our embodied souls, whereas the mountain was created by something equivalent to what created us.
Or you could, I mean, I'm sure Plotinus and Plato would have been fine saying that the gods created the mountain. So
right. But the gods also created us. That's what Plato would say. That's my point. I'm just differentiating that in your example, I would not put something like quote unquote artificial, where we take natural things and then form them further, at the same level of the natural thing in itself. Like a wooden statue that then is, or a wooden statue that is in the form of a man, if you whittle a little person out of it, sculpture, is not at the same level as the living tree itself. As far as like the form of the thing, the form of the tree was created by the gods or the soul or whatever, depending on, I guess, Plato or Plotinus. I'm not sure how Plotinus feels on it yet, because we haven't gotten there. But that's different than me, an embodied soul, cutting the tree and then whittling it. So do you see what I'm trying to say?
Right. Yeah. There's higher levels of creativity at play.
Yes.
Right.
So that's something just to be aware of as or for people to be aware of as we're moving forward, because this is a hierarchical schema of metaphysics. So.
Right. So, I mean, our ability as mortal beings to shape things and to alter matter in a way that different forms are expressed is limited relative to higher intelligence, as the gods. So the gods allow for the expression of humanity and trees and mountains and oceans and the earth and everything, whereas human beings can take a block of marble and create the form of a human. But the thing with matter, though, is that it doesn't have any sort of fixed form. So it's effectively limitless, because you can take the block of marble and fashion any number of forms out of it and pulverize it and turn it into something else.
Correct.
So matter is only a receptacle or
to some degree, but I don't think that's a limitation of the matter. It's a limitation of the human. Because like I can't take, like, as far as I know, or as far as we actually have any evidence, and this I guess is like a loaded comment, but like alchemical things that have been attempted in the past, perhaps you have a different opinion, but can I turn ceramic into gold?
Right.
I don't think I can. I think that physically it is impossible.
Right, but that's delving into ontology, so the actual physical compositions of things. Whereas with this philosophy, we're looking more at epistemology, of like how we perceive things more, rather than what they inherently physically are. I mean, that's one of the problems with philosophy, is that it often has a hard time navigating matters of mind versus matters of material reality.
But those things are, it sounds like from what he's saying that they are, and they're certainly tied, because if I could turn this into gold, That is also me perceiving it as gold. If I want to perceive this as a gold nugget, I can't do that. I mean, the gods probably can. I'm sure they can, or the soul can, but I don't think that's not because this doesn't have the potentiality, or like not this, but like I don't know, yeah, that too. But like a bunch of clay in the soil in my backyard, it maybe has the potentiality to also be a golden statue. It's just I am limited.
Right.
Into making that. That's
We're
so
limited.
it's potentially there, but there's a lot of things where people might be like, well, that's not true. You can't do it. No. You as a material embodied form can't do it. But in the wider chessboard that is reality, and we're just the pawns on it, there's other pieces on this board, to quote Gene Wolfe, that can move in different directions or can do things differently. So yes, there is a potentiality. Not all potentiality of form, though, is actually something that can be done by humans,
Right? We can't
or other beings.
There's limitations to how we can affect and modify matter,
manipulate things to.
Right.
We could still perceive it, though. We can still or imagine it, I guess, which is a kind of ideation. I can imagine that this is a block of gold. I can't actually.
Or I could plate your mug with gold leaf, and it appears to be made of gold.
Yes.
And then but then there's also sort of false.
That's sophistry.
But there's a sort of falsity also there as well. That,
yeah, exactly.
If you come home and your mug is covered in gold leaf, but initially it looks like solid gold, then you perceive not just the form of a mug, but also solid gold. So there's also a sort of falsity there as well. And so
sounds like the falsity of most production of retail goods nowadays.
Right. So there's also, I mean, people also misperceive things as well. So
yes, and if you look at Plato, and probably what Plotinus is going to get to, is that when we misperceive things, it's because we are not as in tune or as much using reason that comes down from the intellect through the soul, but we are more tapped into the chaotic, irrational aspects of the material, which could be like I think like people have like chemical imbalances, a lot of things that are like purely really kind of physical, and the things that come out of that, like even depression. So this is my ideas. I'm not saying this is what it is, but these are not my ideas, but these are things I've pondered, like things like schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, paranoid delusional. A lot of these things I think are very much because a lot of the reason in the person is by not necessarily any fault of their own, but for whatever reason, which I don't know, the chaotic material aspect is really driving the vehicle at that point, or somehow obfuscating that. And so all these things are being perceived, or these levels of sufferings are being gone through because of.
Well, let's just take fear for an example, because that's mentioned in the chapter here. That is the soul itself subject to fear?
No, he says no. So that's the part that gets confusing, because the soul is separate from the complex embodied soul, but there's some aspect of the soul, it sounds like, that he's saying, that is also enmeshed with the body for the physical animation of it. So that gets a little confusing to me. But no, the soul is not experiencing fear itself. It's only the animated body, I guess. And that aspect, this whole like how the body is animated, but also in an aspect that's separate from the soul, is a little confusing to me.
From personal experience, if you practice meditation long enough, you're able to withdraw from your sensory apparatus, but also your emotional states as well, so that if you're experiencing fear, you can actually take a step back and internally actually observe that fear as an observer. And when you're in that state of an observer, then you're no longer really afraid, but rather you're watching fear. It's a very interesting sensation, because you're basically detached from your emotional states, and there's actually a cognition of fear, but there's not necessarily the hard experience of it.
I think that's probably because you're becoming much more aware of the fact that fear is not part of the soul. It's actually a physical, sensible person. It's a physiological thing that's happening.
Yeah, and modern science would recognize that fear is a tangible, physiologically measurable.
Right. And we
phenomenon.
elude ourselves into thinking through the emotion, we elude ourselves into thinking that it's actually from the mind or what people don't usually call, but like the soul aspect of us. But that's just an illusion created by the physiological aspect.
Right. And so you're, and
or the
it's all,
material.
and looking at it from a Stoic point of view, fear is pathologized in the sense that fear arises due to a misjudgment that something is inherently evil or inherently bad. So for example, if, for example, I see a wild animal and it's growling at me and I feel fear, that fear is effectively a misjudgment, because from my perspective, I believe that this state, or the potential state I could find myself in, such as being devoured by this wild animal or injured by this wild animal, is inherently bad. But that's a judgment. And from that judgment arises this physiological and emotional response. But in the absence of judgment in this way, like in the absence of misjudgment, then fear doesn't arise. I mean, that's sort of an extreme example, like if you find yourself in a life or death situation. But in, for example, oh, I'm worried that my investments won't go very well in the next 10 years. And then in 10 years from now, I won't have the money I want to live the sort of life I want to have. And the sort of fear that arises from that, it might be reasonable, but then it begs the question of like, well, why am I having that fear? And it effectively comes down to the belief that having more money is better than having less money, or having good investments is better than having
I think you're right, but I would frame it as, I think what the judgment aspect that you're talking about would be the chemical flight or fight response that we have in our bodies, because through modern neurology and psychology, and I don't think it's contradicting what you're saying at all. I think if anything, it's kind of looking at it from a different perspective or validating it further in ways that maybe people can grasp a little better. But that judgment is the material aspect, because there's a thing in us that, like, even if, like, say you don't have a great relationship with your family or something and you're anxious to see your father or your mother, you're not actually afraid that they're going to kill you or whatever, but the material aspect of us is so, the human body, the animal part of us is just wired for very simple things, fight or flight. So the moment that we make the judgment of this being one thing or another, what kicks in is fight or flight, regardless of it not actually any longer being a survival thing. And that creates fear or anxiety in us.
Right. So we also have to contend with the physical realities and look at it also from this modern point of view, where, you know, they've analyzed the brain and they see that you have different parts of the brain which correspond to different parts of evolutionary history in human physiology.
But at the end of the day, it's still all, my point is, though, all these things that we're basically just better understanding the material.
Yeah.
And I think that is a useful tool to better liberate ourselves from the illusions of the material by better understanding what's eluding us.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something that the ancient philosophers don't really discuss, because they didn't necessarily have an idea of,
right,
you know, evolutionary history, and
right.
They didn't frame things in this sort of way. Here's the question, though, is do you think it is worthwhile to address fear? Do you think that, like, for example, the Stoics pathologize fear because it's a misjudgment, and if you eliminate this misjudgment, then you're not supposed to experience fear anymore. You'll be effectively fearless, because the only thing that you have control over is your own mind, and anything external to the mind is an indifferent.
I guess that depends on what the teleology of the situation is. Are we trying to, yes and no, I don't know. If you don't care about dying, if your belief system, or, I mean, if you're asking me, I don't even think Plotinus would say that necessarily all fear should be eradicated during the living life. I don't think he was a proponent of, like, suicide.
No, but I think if you, like, eliminate fear from your mind, like, you're not going to become irrational and like go out and hurt yourself. It's more like,
so are you asking if we can still continue to have like the ability to have self-preservation without fear?
Well, that's one question. Like, I tend to think that removal of fear from the mind is a worthwhile goal because
I think so. Now that you're rephrasing it, yes. Yeah, I think that if by eliminating fear, we are still able to have the self-preserving aspects of rationality, I do think is worthwhile. I mean,
but I think, I mean, that's, this is coming more from a Stoic point of view, but if
I'm
you
not a
do,
Stoic.
if you
But
do,
go on.
if you do eliminate fear from your mind, then your mind is effectively governed more by reason, and that also applies to other passions, like, for example, unreasonable desire, and those sort
I
of.
think all of the vices, if we want to call them that, boil down to a kind of fear. I think all of them, even psychologically, the reasons people have certain kinds of like impulses or addictions or bad relationships all come from a sort of fear, either lived at some point traumatically or from their childhood, in which the attachment with their parent was not great in one way or another. But even that, if you boil it down, even though they're not consciously aware of it, it all comes from some early on physical little animal fear. So I think it's all the bad stuff. Yes, it boils down to fear on some level, and then there's different aspects of it that are played out depending how, or fear can then create a bunch of other symptoms, I think. So
Right.
yes, I guess I do agree with you. I think that the removal of fear is a good thing. I think that there's aspects of my own life, not that I've been able to remove fear completely, but there are definitely aspects of my life where I have been able to remove fear, specifically in my interpersonal relationships, both romantically and with friends, where there used to be, I think, an attachment to like the fear of them not caring about me or the fear of me being the person who cared more. And once I was able to remove this fear completely, I was no longer suffering about my relationships with others. It actually had the positive aspect of me no longer feeding into those symptomatic aspects of fear, but using more reason in why I chose certain people over others, or cultivated certain friendships over others that were not coming from fear-based symptoms. And there's no longer a lot of fear, pain, feelings of insecurities in general around those. So yes, in the small ways that I have been able to eliminate fear in my life, it's been very beneficial. And it has not made those relationships less than. It's actually made them better.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree. Yeah. I think it's a difficult thing to do. And I think often people, we are so tied to our emotions, and we make our emotions so much part of our identity
Mm-hmm.
that people, I think, sometimes are uncomfortable to untie themselves from things like fear because they think it makes them less human. But I don't think that's necessarily true. But that
Kind of brings up some science fiction, like, for example, in Star Trek, Data, his journey throughout Star Trek, throughout many seasons, is basically learning what it is to be human, because he starts off without emotion, and then later on he experiences emotion.
right.
So there's a kind of a character arc there, but the whole exploration is theoretically, what if you did have artificial intelligence without emotion, but it wants to learn emotion?
But that goes back to in the book, in the
Right.
Enneads, he says the true self is the undescended soul, and the undescended soul doesn't have fear. So my point is, we just have these conceptions from like the material world that our identity is so tied to our behavioral maladies is really what they are. When that's not true, I think we can get, and I think that holds a lot of people back, just because we have these misconceptions that thinking that letting go of some of these kinds of emotions makes us, colder or less empathetic beings fundamentally. But if you look at even Data, if you remember, there were episodes where different things happened. Some of them he experienced anger or evil, and that was not good. Near the end of I think the thing that he experienced, the two things I remember him experiencing, which were, or like kind of approaching experiencing, which were beneficial, was creativity, because he liked to paint, and like kind of actually experiencing the creative aspect, the soul aspect in some way, and empathy. I think those are the important aspects, which are not specifically tied. I don't know, we'll get there, but creativity certainly is not tied to the material. It's coming from the soul. It is the soul. And empathy,
But
we haven't gotten to that yet.
I think you can have empathy without having necessarily like a strong emotional component to it.
Correct. That's what I'm saying.
Like, I mean, one of the classical examples would be, maybe we could draw it from Buddhism, where like a physician is not going to be doing much benefit to his or her patient if they are crying while they're attempting to perform
Agreed.
surgery or administer medicine. But if they're, you know, in a very solid, rational state of mind, then they're in the best position, optimal position to help other people. And I mean, from what I've heard from people who have been to war as well, is that if you have somebody in charge who is very much detached from their emotions and rational, then in the field, then it's much more beneficial than having somebody who's, you know, panicking or in some
Oh,
sort of
absolutely.
bit
I
of, bit of
think
rage or something. So I think naturally, if we work towards the elimination of these passions
absolutely.
and
I
our
think a lot of cases where people say they're being empathetic towards someone and they're overly emotional about it, I think there's an aspect of that where it becomes selfish, and it's not even that you're actually that empathetic about the other person. In the example of, like, say that there's a family member that is suffering something that they're going to die. I think a
Right.
lot of time, and I'm not blaming people for feeling this way, you know, it is a difficult thing to traverse, but a lot of that empathy is not, there's aspects of it where like you're miserable, you're so miserable, but that really has nothing to do with your actual empathy with the person. That has everything to do with your own selfish reasons of fear and anxiety of losing this person for your own, well, for yourself, right? It's not about the other person, and that doesn't mean it's malicious. It's just not actually the empathy. So yes, I agree that having very strong emotions about things does not empathy make.
Well, I think also a lot of our emotions are socially conditioned as well.
No, absolutely.
There's an expectation that you'll have a certain expression of emotion at certain occasions, or you'll have these, again, like emotional expressions when it's deemed not just convenient but almost like obligatory.
I think the fact that it's socially conditioned rewires them. I think it's because maybe in human history or evolutionarily, like these kinds of reactions are the majority. They're just quite common. And then those things become associated with it in a society's form. They become confirmed. And then you teach people, like if you teach that this is the right way to react or that this is normal in a child or whoever, like they're already probably predisposed to it, at least on some level. And when you reconfirm certain things, those neurological pathways in the mind will then be reinforced. And then you're going to start reacting like that, subconsciously, not even realizing that it's because of this societal indoctrination. And I'm not going to make a judgment on whether or not that's good or bad. I personally don't think that. I think that society is useful as material beings. But yes, definitely, a lot of things are not quite as absolute as we might think they are at a first glance.
Well, did you see that leads to one of the problems of, you know, the philosophical life, and maybe you could even say like the spiritual life as well, is that the less directed you are by social norms and conventions and your upbringing and your cultural mores and so forth, that you're more likely to live a life that people would consider irregular, unusual.
Correct.
And so you become like Socrates. I mean, like recently somebody was asking me, why did you wear gym clothes to the conference?
Was that me?
No, that wasn't you. Maybe you said that too. But yeah, I was thinking like, well, why is it that I'm expected to at least put on a dress shirt when I go to a conference? Well, because it's professional. Well, I understand.
I think in that we're falling into the realm of things that are functional and practical in your mortal life. So if it doesn't actually have any use for you to present or be perceived a certain way, then fine, whatever. But if there is some goal that you are trying to reach, and that may be a factor in facilitating it, then social norms are useful.
Right. In this way, but in this way, we sort of become almost like mercenary, or what's the word? Almost like, yeah, I guess the word would be almost like mercenary. I don't want to say Machiavellian.
Are you passively aggressively attacking me because I want to update your wardrobe?
I was just thinking of the example of Socrates, where he just wore the same old tunic.
Oh, he wouldn't care. He'd probably say
cloak.
some really unpleasant things to the other person. But I know you're way too nice to do that.
So my point is, the more you sort of detach yourself from a lot of material realities and social expectations that are based upon these material realities, that you inevitably have to start playing the role of a good citizen, whereas you're not actually believing inherently that this is important. You're just
Well, what's
doing it.
actually a good citizen, though?
Well, like I would say good citizen, and like, for example, in the modern professional world, you're expected to, comb your hair and put on decent clothing and so forth.
To be a presentable citizen.
Presentable citizen. So your moral character and your competency is judged based on your
Right.
wardrobe and your presentation.
Well, that's
Not-
because most people don't move beyond the social rules that exist. The social rules have a use, and it's only to govern those material aspects of the lower being. But most people seem to not, this is super pompous, but I don't care. Most people seem to at least behave and act like that is all that exists. So yes, in that sense, of course you're going to move away from it, because you start realizing that a lot of that the material stuff is really not that important, that all this other stuff higher up in the emanations is relevant. So if the point of those social mores are only to reinforce certain kinds of things in the material realm, and even of that, there's, more or less practical aspects of the material realm, like things like you probably should eat healthy or drink water and move and exercise. Those are things that probably I don't think that Plato or Socrates would necessarily argue with us. In fact, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't. I know they wouldn't.
Plato was a wrestler. Yeah.
Yeah, they definitely cared about those things, because those things are fundamental things that keep the body that is animated with the soul, or that is animated by the soul, healthy and best functioning in this mortal life, to then contemplate those things. So things like that are important, but then all this other stuff, they don't care, because they're getting further and further from it. And so, yes, then you start becoming an eccentric in the eyes of others.
Right.
And I think that is not something unfamiliar to either of us to some degree. Yes, I definitely have to masquerade, but it's not something that's difficult to do, or that it causes me any suffering on some level, like to be a certain kind of person at work in my day job, for example.
It's an affectation. So effectively, we're trying to please other people because we want something, and with the belief that if we get what we want, that it's somehow better than what we presently have, such as, for example, maintaining our employment, or getting the good graces of our supervisor, who will, promote us or demote us and so forth.
But our true self sometimes also, like most people, it's not like we're born with as a kid or as a teenager, most people are not very sure of who their true self is, or their truer self is. A lot of people never are. So I would say that maybe some of those affectations preceded, as you've already mentioned, and then as we move forward, as we read, as we learn things and experience things and ponder things and come to conclusions that we think are reasonable or true, at least for ourselves, then our true self starts coming out, right? Which is maybe this eccentric personality, or things that are different than the norm. So at least for me, like, I've certainly changed in the, as time moves forward, I've constantly changed as a person, or what I like, what I don't like, and therefore even behaviorally.
Right.
Or not what I like and what I don't like, but I guess I mean is what I like, what I don't like, what I think is true and what I think is not true. And therefore also is or is not important, has also shaped my behaviors and changed them. And what is good or bad, or like useful or unuseful to me, what causes suffering or doesn't cause suffering, what will basically make me a better person, and in this context, bring me closer to being more, to perceiving more my true self. Because it's not really about getting closer to your true self, it's just being able to like clean the muck off of the world and more clearly seeing the true self, at least I think in the dynamic that is presented by Plotinus, because he says, it's all here. It's already all here. The God, the one, the intellect, it's already here. We're just
right. We've
never
actually been separated from it for many.
Yes, exactly.
We just perceive ourselves as separate from it, and as these biochemical beings walking around with our limited lifespans and concerns and so forth. But really, there never actually was a separation. In fact, there's not even been like a chronological separation. There wasn't even necessarily a beginning to this separation. It's just like a misperception on our part.
Yeah, we have to, as the Italians might say, take the prosciutto off of our eyes. So I guess coming to that point, do we want to discuss kind of why or what he means by that bad things are only I'm assuming he means like subsequently, therefore, bad things are only committed by the body. And he also says that that only the body, or rather not the soul is not judged. It's just the material aspect of the being that is judged.
Right, right. And there's also this separation of the soul. So there's the, the higher soul, which is not directly involved in matter. And then that's the immortal soul. And then there is this sort of mortal aspect to our experience, which is that which is judged.
So that's the part, and that's not just is the physical material. That's the part that's hard to understand. So I understand the immortal soul. He also says, I think in the text, that it's almost like if you imagined a light being reflected onto an object and lighting it, illuminating it, that is the immortal soul. So it's illuminating it and, having an effect, influencing the object because it's shining light onto it. But it itself is in no way actually in contact with or influenced by the object that it is illuminating. But then he also speaks of some other part that is enmeshed with the object to animate it and to allow it to have discursive thought. That's the part that's
right.
confusing.
Let me quote from the book. It says, "In fact, if the souls in them are, as it is said, human souls which have erred, the separable part of the soul does not belong to the beasts. It is there, but it is not there for them. Rather, what they have self-awareness of is the reflection of the soul that goes with the body. Actually, such a body has been, in a way, made by a reflection of soul. On the other hand, if the soul of a human being has not entered it, it becomes the kind of living being it is due to the illumination coming from the soul of the cosmos." Yeah, that's a lot. And then the next section asks the question, but if the soul is inerrant, how can there be punishment for it?
Right.
But he also goes on to say here that the line of reasoning that makes the soul inerrant assumes that it is one and totally simple, claiming that soul and the essence of soul are identical.
Which the essence of soul, is my understanding, is that that's the part enmeshed with the material that's actually descended.
Well, he says here, the soul then is a composite of all these things, and it is actually affected as a whole, and it is composite that errs, and it is the composite that errs. So it is that which is enmeshed or which is interwoven.
Right.
So there's the mortal aspect, and then there is the immortal aspect. So there has to be a distinction made between the two.
But that's still part of the soul, though.
Right. Well, there's the undescended higher reality, which is unerring and immutable, and then there is this composite aspect to it that can err. So that would be our normal person as a material being. That's what we would normally think of as ourselves.
But that's like our consciousness then, because it's not just the automaton of us. It's not just us as like chemical wired lunks of meat. So is he saying like basically like there's a soul that is affected because it's pure and simple, and then is it maybe the I'm going to just use this analogy, the light that's reflecting onto the material, that part that actually touches upon it, is that the part that's kind of enmeshed with it? And if it can judge, what happens after death? Like, does that mean that?
So in our, that's a good question. Like you said, we can understand this is not like a higher, soul, but rather it's our consciousness that we normally experience, like what we're experiencing right now. This is, consciousness. And so our consciousness in modern terms is also tied in with our physiology and all the neurons firing in our brain.
To some degree, they still don't understand consciousness. And I don't think they ever will if they look at it purely empirically, through sense perception.
And that's what errs. And even just from like an everyday point of view, we can see that we misjudge things and we miscognize things. And that is also subject to all sorts of moral failings as well.
So is he saying that portion is not immortal?
Well, it's effectively that part is effectively tied to our physical form. That would be that would be mortal. But then there is this higher soul which is eternal and
Okay.
cannot err because it's eternal.
The question then is, are we then fundamentally not judged after death in the way that like the Abrahamic religion might look at it? Because if the consciousness dies when we die, when the material part dies, and all that remains is the immortal, which is free of, I guess, sin, for lack of another term, then there is no, and we return.
This goes into the discussion of metempsychosis, and metempsychosis is the word for reincarnation in Greek. And so
Right.
Plato,
So he does follow Plato's ideas on that.
right. And well, Iamblichus
Okay.
also speaks of this as well. That
Well, does
you know,
Plotinus? I guess we'll find out. But
right. So things that you have
Okay.
done in a past life can affect you in the present life, and evils that you commit will affect outcomes in future lifetimes as well.
Right.
So this is, it's been pointed out many times. This is very similar to what Buddhist cosmology.
Well, according to Plato, like I clearly was a crappy man in a previous life because now I'm a woman. So I mean,
Buddhists,
I was like,
a
okay.
lot of Buddhists, incidentally, have similar ideas too.
I think that's the material part that's making those conclusions as far as the gender. But so I guess we'll cover that, I guess, at a future point in more detail when he probably gets into it.
Right.
He does one of the other questions, the ambiguity of we. Oh yeah, I mean that's kind of what we've been talking about, the ambiguity of we between embodied and disembodied self. That's kind of what we've been discussing, and it's a difficult thing to kind of understand. And I don't know if fully we've really understood it here today, but we've kind of maybe have some ideas about it. And then the other thing he touches on is the psychical status of children and animals. Well, I don't really understand how that works for children, but as far as animals, I did understand that they are animated by some aspect of the soul because they're material, you know, they're created by the soul as impressions of some
Right,
form of, and then they're animated by the soul to some degree. They just don't have the level of discursive reasoning as far as we can tell. As far as children, I mean, he kind of says something to that degree, but obviously we evolve or we grow up and become more and more. Yeah. So I'm not sure what his what he was trying to say about kids.
Well, discursive thinking, intelligible phenomena to be able to cognize things accurately and consistently, that comes with maturity. So I guess the idea is it's like a toddler can cognize some things, but they don't necessarily cognize things in the same way that an adult would in terms of being able to distinguish things. And also an expression of the forms as well through the medium of creativity. So if you ask, like if you remember when you're 2-3 years old, if you're asked to draw a car or something like that, you end up just putting a whole bunch of scratches on the paper. And as far as you could tell, that's a car, but nobody else recognizes that as a car. But over time, you can, express those things more clearly because you have a clearer idea in your mind.
Well, I don't know. Is that why? Is it because you have a clear idea in your mind, or is it because your motor skills in the material world have gotten better and more sophisticated?
Well, that's a good question.
I think if we stick to the discursive aspect, I think that makes more sense, where as we continue to develop, even as adults, if one chooses to mature in their, let's call it spirituality or their wisdom, it is a forward-moving maturation of contemplation on those things. So obviously, like as a baby, I'm assuming for like the necessary nature of material, it's basically just focused on the survival of this material animated thing. And as it develops and as the aspects of the physiological being develop to be able to accommodate the soul, like the way the brain or the baby's eyes develop, once it gets to a point where it can even start really having the faculties to start contemplating the soul and discursive things, it will do so. I think it's just a matter of like, since humans experience time linearly, we mature that way. And also just physiological aspects of the human being that need to reach a certain point before it can even like start to really perceive itself.
Yeah, the physical faculties have to mature to the point that certain levels of discursive thinking, empathy, and that sort of thing as well
are capable, yes.
Are possible. Right. Yeah.
Going back to Plato and the Timaeus, I think also like experience, right? We learn things from the environment around us. And that I think is the aspect of us perceiving the same and the different. That's how humans learn. Like everything in the universe, according to Plato, or at least in the world, or that we perceive, it's all been built by the one or the demiurge.
Well, it's the demiurge who sets the universe in motion with the planets and the stars and so forth. And so there's a gradual build up to reality.
Right. Well, in any case, just the fact that like we can even think about anything. If everything was the same, there's nothing to think. The only way we can have a reason is by, on a very like fundamental level, is being able to do some sort of comparison of sameness or difference from other things. And I think that this being a discursive tool that exists is something that children also use. So the more experience they have with that, which is basically like learning from others in a more, if you want to refine it to that, but fundamentally it's like more experience of sameness and difference, and using that to develop or have more experience in discursive thought. Is probably why as well.
Okay, well, that's probably a good place to wrap up for this session.
Next one's on virtues, and we have already touched upon
right, so we'll have to explore these things in the future. So we'll just wrap things up here. And to everybody who's listening, thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.